Detroit Metropolitan Wayne County Airport had that particular smell that all airports share. Recycled air mixed with coffee, jet fuel, and the quiet desperation of people who had somewhere else to be. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that pale, unflattering glow that made even healthy people look exhausted. It was 6:47 in the morning, and Gate C-14 was filling up with passengers waiting for the first flight to Atlanta. Among them sat a man who most people didn't bother to look at twice. Henry Lewis occupied a wheelchair near the window, his leather briefcase resting across his lap like an old friend. He was somewhere in his early 60s, with silver streaking through his close-cropped hair and a neatly trimmed beard that gave him the appearance of a retired professor or perhaps a church deacon from the South Side. His clothes were simple but quality. A pressed navy blazer over a cream sweater, dark slacks, and leather shoes that had been polished recently but not obsessively. What most people missed, if they bothered to glance his way at all, was his posture. Despite the wheelchair, despite his age, despite the early hour, Henry Lewis sat with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades commanding rooms full of people who thought they were smarter than him. His hands rested calmly on the briefcase, and his eyes moved slowly across the gate area, taking in details that others ignored. The departure board showed a 45-minute delay, mechanical issue. The collective groan from the waiting passengers had already faded into resigned phone scrolling and overpriced coffee runs. Henry had simply nodded once when the announcement came, then returned to his silent observation. Near the check-in counter, two gate agents huddled together in the universal posture of employees who thought no one important was watching. Kyle Bennett was in his late 20s, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. He wore his airline uniform like it was a badge of authority rather than a service position, and his smile had that particular quality reserved for passengers he deemed worthy of his charm. Amanda Shaw stood beside him, mid-30s, following his lead with the comfortable complicity of someone who had learned that laughing at Kyle's jokes made the shift go faster. Kyle's eyes drifted toward Henry, and his mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Another wheelchair guy," he muttered, just loud enough for Amanda to hear, or so he thought. "Bet he wants a free upgrade." Amanda smirked, glancing over her shoulder at the man sitting alone by the window. "They always do. Watch, he'll ask for priority boarding and then take forever getting down the jet bridge." Kyle snorted. "Probably hasn't flown since Reagan was president. These old guys always act like the whole plane should wait for them." What neither of them realized was that sound travels in airports. The hard floors, the high ceilings, the glass walls. All of it created acoustics that carried whispered conversations further than people expected. Henry heard every word. His expression didn't change. His hands didn't tighten on his briefcase. He simply filed the information away, the same way he had filed away 1,000 similar moments over 63 years of being a black man in America. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His thumb traced the edge of his briefcase. He breathed slowly through his nose. These were the only signs, and nobody was watching closely enough to notice them. Nearby, another airline employee had noticed the exchange. Tracy Mills stood behind the counter, ostensibly organizing boarding passes, but her eyes kept drifting toward Kyle and Amanda. Tracy was in her early 40s, a black woman who had worked for the airline for 12 years and had learned the particular skill of seeing everything while appearing to see nothing. She had heard what Kyle said. She had seen the way he looked at the man in the wheelchair. Her jaw tightened too, but she said nothing. Tracy had bills to pay. She had a daughter in community college and a mother in assisted living, and a supervisor who had made it clear that team players didn't make waves. She had watched moments like this before. She had stayed quiet before. The guilt sat in her stomach like a stone, but the rent was due on the 15th, and Kyle's uncle was apparently friends with someone in regional management. So Tracy Mills organized her boarding passes and said nothing at all. Henry Lewis continued to watch the departure board. Atlanta. That city held something he needed to reclaim, not a possession, not a memory, something more valuable than either. But that was a story nobody at gate C-14 would have believed, even if he had told them. The truth was simple, though not a soul in that airport suspected it. Everyone at that gate saw an old black man in a wheelchair, a symbol of limitation, a figure to be pitied at best and mocked at worst. They saw someone to be managed, processed, and forgotten. Nobody saw the man who had built his first company in a basement apartment in Evanston. Nobody saw the man who had revolutionized logistics for 3 major airlines before his 40th birthday. Nobody saw the man whose signature appeared on documents that affected the livelihoods of thousands of employees across the country. Nobody saw the man who signed their paychecks. And that was exactly how Henry Lewis wanted it. 46 years before Kyle Bennett made his joke about wheelchairs, a 17-year-old boy stood on the frozen tarmac of O'Hare International Airport with wind cutting through his thin jacket like it had a personal grudge. His name was Henry Lewis, and he had been loading luggage onto planes since 4 in the morning. It was now 6:15. The sun was just starting to appear over the Chicago skyline, and he couldn't feel his fingers. The year was 1979. Disco was dying, gas prices were climbing, and a black teenager from the West Side working the ramps at O'Hare was about as invisible as a person could be. Henry's hands were cracked from the cold. His back ached from lifting bags that wealthy travelers had overpacked with things they probably didn't need. His breath came out in thick clouds that disappeared instantly into the freezing air. But his eyes were sharp. Even then, at 17, Henry Lewis had the kind of eyes that took in everything and gave away nothing. He watched the planes come and go. He watched the ground crews and the mechanics and the dispatchers with their clipboards. He watched the supervisors in their warm offices, drinking coffee while the ramp workers froze. He watched the pilots striding through the terminal like minor gods, and he watched the passengers who never once looked at the men loading their luggage. And he learned. Henry learned that respect wasn't given. It was earned through endurance, through showing up when others quit, through being the last one on the ramp when the snow was blowing sideways, and everyone else had found an excuse to disappear. He learned that invisible men hear everything, because people forget to watch their words around those they consider beneath notice. He learned that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes power waits. By 25, Henry had worked his way off the ramp and into dispatch. He was the first black dispatcher in his department, a fact that his supervisor mentioned exactly once before never acknowledging it again. Henry didn't need acknowledgement. He needed knowledge. He spent every spare moment learning the systems that made airlines function, the logistics of fuel, the mathematics of scheduling, the delicate choreography of getting hundreds of planes in and out of one of the busiest airports in the world. By 33, he had taken everything he learned and founded Lewis Logistics Solutions in a basement apartment in Evanston. The company started with 3 employees and 1 contract. Within 5 years, it had revolutionized operations for regional carriers across the Midwest. Within 10, the major airlines came calling. Henry never forgot where he came from. He never forgot the frozen ramps and the cracked hands and the supervisors who looked through him like he wasn't there. But he didn't carry bitterness about it either. He simply carried knowledge. Knowledge of how systems worked. Knowledge of how people behaved when they thought they were unobserved. Knowledge of the difference between those who had earned their positions and those who had merely inherited them. By 48, a major airline consortium acquired Lewis Logistics Solutions for a figure that the business press called substantial and Henry called adequate. He stayed on as a silent partner and advisor, his name appearing on documents but rarely in headlines. He preferred it that way. Wealth without visibility, influence without celebrity. Then came the stroke. It happened on a Tuesday night in his home office in Evanston. Henry was reviewing acquisition documents at 3 in the morning, the same work ethic that had carried him from the frozen ramps to the boardroom. One moment he was reading a quarterly report. The next moment he was on the floor, unable to move the left side of his body, unable to call for help, able only to wait and hope that someone would find him before it was too late. His housekeeper found him at 7 the next morning. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. They said the stroke had been severe but not catastrophic. They said that with physical therapy he might regain some mobility, but the wheelchair would likely be permanent. Henry listened to all of it with the same quiet attention he had given to every challenge in his life. He didn't rage against the diagnosis. He didn't sink into self-pity. He simply adapted. What the doctors didn't understand was that Henry Lewis had spent his entire life being underestimated. The wheelchair didn't change who he was. It simply changed how others perceived him. And Henry had learned long ago that perception was a tool like any other. It could be used against you, or it could be used by you. In the months following his recovery, Henry noticed something that others might have found demeaning, but he found illuminating. People spoke more freely around him now. Executives who would have guarded their words in his presence now chatted openly, apparently assuming that the man in the wheelchair was no longer a threat to their ambitions. Service workers who would have been professionally careful now revealed their true attitudes, apparently believing that an older black man in a wheelchair couldn't possibly matter to their careers. Invisibility, Henry realized, was not a weakness. It was a weapon. He began conducting what he privately called audits. Not financial audits, though those happened too, personal audits, cultural audits. He would travel through the various operations of companies in which he held significant interests, not as Henry Lewis the business legend, but as Henry Lewis the anonymous passenger, the old man in the wheelchair, the person nobody bothered to impress. What he saw during these audits would have depressed a lesser man, but Henry didn't have time for depression. He had work to do, systems to fix, cultures to change, people to observe. Which brought him to Gate C-14 at Detroit Metropolitan Airport on a cold Tuesday morning, sitting silently while 2 employees laughed about wheelchairs and a 3rd employee said nothing at all. Henry's eyes moved from the departure board to Kyle Bennett's smirking face, then to Amanda Shaw's complicit smile, then to Tracy Mills' downcast eyes. He noted each of them. He understood each of them, and he had plans for all 3. The boy who had loaded bags at O'Hare in 1979 was still there, somewhere inside the man in the wheelchair. That boy had learned patience on the frozen ramps. He had learned that the people who laughed loudest often fell hardest. He had learned that dignity wasn't something others could take from you unless you let them. And he had learned, above all else, that revenge was most effective when no one saw it coming. The boarding announcement crackled over the PA system at 7:42, the mechanical delay finally resolved, and the flight to Atlanta ready to receive passengers. Throughout Gate C-14, people began the familiar ritual of gathering belongings, checking boarding passes, and jockeying for position near the jet bridge entrance. Henry Lewis remained where he was, near the window, waiting. He knew the protocol. Wheelchair passengers typically boarded first, before the general crowd. It was standard airline policy, a matter of practical logistics rather than special treatment. The narrow aisles and limited space made it sensible to get mobility-impaired passengers settled before the rush began. Kyle Bennett, apparently, had a different interpretation. He approached Henry with a clipboard in hand, his stride carrying that particular combination of authority and condescension that certain people perfect when dealing with those they consider beneath them. He didn't crouch to Henry's level. He didn't make genuine eye contact. He stood over the wheelchair and spoke in the slightly louder, slightly slower cadence that people use with those they assume cannot fully understand normal speech. "Sir, you'll need to wait. Wheelchairs slow things down. We'll get you on after the other passengers are settled." Henry looked up at him calmly. His voice was measured and quiet. "Where would you like me to wait?" Kyle gestured vaguely toward a distant seating area, far from the gate, far from the other passengers, far from anywhere that mattered. Over there should be fine. Someone will come get you when we're ready. The dismissal was complete. Henry nodded once and began rolling his wheelchair toward the indicated area. Behind him, he heard Kyle return to Amanda, heard the barely suppressed laughter, heard words that were meant to be private but traveled clearly across the gate. See what I mean? They always want special treatment but then can't handle basic instructions. Amanda's response was quieter but no less cruel. At least this one didn't argue. You should have seen the guy last week, acted like we owed him something. Henry positioned himself in the distant seating area and waited. Around him, the gate continued its ordinary chaos. Families gathered their children. Business travelers typed furiously on laptops. A young couple argued quietly about whether they had packed everything. Nobody looked at the old man in the wheelchair. Nobody wondered why he had been sent to sit alone while everyone else crowded toward the jet bridge. Tracy Mills looked. For a moment her eyes met Henry's across the gate. He saw the conflict there, the guilt warring with the fear, the knowledge that what was happening was wrong battling against the certainty that speaking up would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. Henry didn't blame her. He had seen too many people trapped in similar positions to waste energy on blame. But he noted it. He filed it away. The boarding continued. First-class passengers walked down the jet bridge with their leather bags and their air of entitlement. Business class followed, only slightly less self-satisfied. Then the general boarding began, the mass of economy passengers shuffling forward in their designated groups. Still, no one came for Henry. 15 minutes passed. The gate area emptied. The final boarding call was announced, and still Henry sat alone in the distant seating area where Kyle had sent him, watching the last passengers disappear down the jet bridge. Only then did Kyle approach again, this time with visible irritation on his face. "Sir, we're going to need you to board now, or we'll have to document you as a no-show." Henry's voice remained calm. "I was told to wait here until someone came to get me." Kyle's jaw tightened. "Well, I'm telling you now, the plane is almost fully boarded. You need to move." "I'm happy to board," Henry said quietly. "I was simply following your instructions." Something flickered in Kyle's eyes. Not guilt, not recognition of his own contradiction. Something closer to annoyance at being challenged, even mildly, by someone he had already categorized as powerless. He leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to something that might have been meant as confidential but carried clearly. "Look, sir, I don't know how you usually travel, but here we have procedures. If you can't follow simple directions, I can call security to assist you. Would you prefer that?" The word hung in the air. Security. The implication was unmistakable. The threat was clear. An old black man in a wheelchair, potentially causing a disturbance, potentially needing to be removed. Henry had seen this script before. He knew exactly how it would play if he raised his voice, if he protested, if he gave Kyle any excuse to escalate. So he gave no excuse. "That won't be necessary," Henry said. "I'll board now." He rolled his wheelchair toward the jet bridge, moving at a steady pace, not rushing to satisfy Kyle's impatience, not dawdling to prove a point. Behind him, he heard Kyle's voice, speaking to Amanda with the casual cruelty of someone who believed he was among friends. "I swear these people always want special treatment, every single time." Amanda's response was the verbal equivalent of a shrug. Just be glad he didn't ask for a first-class upgrade. They always try. Henry paused at the threshold of the jet bridge. His back was to them, but his hearing had always been exceptional, and airport acoustics carried sound in unpredictable ways. He heard every word. He noted the phrase, "these people," and what it meant. He noted the assumptions embedded in, "they always try." He filed it all away in the same mental ledger where he had been recording observations for the past 6 decades. Then he continued down the jet bridge, alone, rolling toward the plane while the echoes of laughter faded behind him. The flight attendant who met him at the aircraft door was professionally courteous but clearly rushed. She guided him to his seat in coach 34A by the window and helped him transfer from the wheelchair with practiced efficiency. The wheelchair was tagged and taken to be stored in the cargo hold. Henry settled into his seat, buckled his seatbelt, and looked out the window at the gray Detroit morning. The plane filled around him. Passengers stuffed bags into overhead bins and argued about armrests and settled into the resigned discomfort of economy travel. No one sat directly next to Henry. The middle seat remained empty, one of those small mercies that frequent travelers learn to appreciate. The doors closed, the safety demonstration played, the plane began its taxi toward the runway. From his window seat, Henry watched the airport fall away as the aircraft lifted into the sky. Detroit grew smaller below him, becoming first a city, then a pattern, then just a smear of gray against the winter landscape. He thought about Kyle Bennett's smirk. He thought about Amanda Shaw's complicit laughter. He thought about Tracy Mills' silent guilt. He thought about the files in his briefcase, the ones that outlined his real reason for traveling anonymously through the airline's operations, the ones that documented patterns of behavior across multiple airports, multiple gates, multiple employees who believed no one important was watching. And he thought about Atlanta, the corporate headquarters waiting for him there, the meetings already scheduled, the decisions already made. From the outside, it looked like defeat. An old man humiliated, sent to wait in a corner, threatened with security, mocked behind his back. It looked like another story of powerlessness, another example of dignity crushed beneath casual cruelty. But Henry Lewis had learned something in 46 years of business. The loudest revenge was the one nobody saw coming. The most complete victory was the one that looked like surrender right up until the moment it didn't. The plane climbed above the clouds, and the sun appeared for the first time that day, bright and cold, and indifferent to the small dramas playing out 30,000 feet below. If you have ever been judged before you spoke a single word, if you have ever been dismissed because of how you looked, what you wore, or the chair you sat in, if you have ever felt invisible in a room full of people who assumed you did not matter, then you already know what is coming next. This story was made for voices like yours, for experiences like yours, for the dignity that others tried to take but could never truly touch. If this speaks to you, then you are exactly who this channel was built for. Stay with me because what happens next changes everything. The Atlanta airport felt different from the moment Henry's wheelchair touched the jet bridge. The light was warmer. The pace was faster. The energy carried the particular hum of a city that considered itself the capital of the New South, a place where black success was visible in ways that other American cities still struggled to achieve. Henry rolled through the terminal with the same quiet observation he had maintained throughout the journey. His eyes moved across the gate agents and the ground crews and the passengers rushing to their connections. He noted the differences from Detroit, the diversity of the staff, the general professionalism of the interactions, the small courtesies that suggested a different culture or at least a better managed one. But his attention shifted when he saw the woman in the navy suit approaching. Elaine Porter moved through the crowd with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent 30 years navigating corporate hierarchies and had long since stopped apologizing for taking up space. She was in her mid-50s, with sharp eyes behind designer glasses and the kind of presence that made people step aside without quite knowing why. Her position was corporate compliance director, which meant she spent her days investigating the gap between what companies said they valued and what they actually did. She approached Henry's wheelchair and, unlike Kyle Bennett, she crouched to his level, not condescending, respectful, meeting him where he was. "Mr. Lewis," she said quietly, "I didn't expect you until the Atlanta office. I thought your audit of the Detroit operations would take at least another day." Henry allowed himself a small smile, I saw what I needed to see. Elaine's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That concerning. Let's discuss it inside. They moved together through the terminal, Elaine walking beside his wheelchair rather than ahead of it, adjusting her pace to his without making a performance of it. Other travelers glanced at them, perhaps curious about the dynamic between the distinguished woman in the suit and the older man in the wheelchair, but no one recognized the significance of what they were seeing. The car waiting at the curb was black and unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that was designed to be overlooked. The driver helped Henry transfer to the back seat with practiced efficiency, folding the wheelchair into the trunk with movements that suggested this was a familiar routine. Elaine slid in beside him, and the car pulled away from the airport toward the gleaming skyline of downtown Atlanta. The Meridian Air corporate headquarters occupied one of those glass towers that had sprouted along Peachtree Center in the years when Atlanta was reinventing itself as an international hub. 40 floors of offices and conference rooms, and the particular kind of expensive minimalism that announced serious corporate power. Henry had been in hundreds of buildings like it over the years. He had helped design the organizational structures that filled many of them. The lobby security recognized Elaine and nodded her through. If they recognized Henry, they gave no sign, though several of them straightened slightly as his wheelchair passed. Word traveled in corporate buildings, even when that word was supposed to be confidential. The elevator rose to the 40th floor without stopping. Executive level. The doors opened on a reception area that probably cost more to decorate than Henry's first 3 years of salary combined. An assistant appeared immediately, guiding them toward a conference room at the end of the hall. The conference room was already occupied. Around the long mahogany table sat the people who actually ran Meridian Air's daily operations. The chief operating officer, a white man in his 60s who had come up through the pilot ranks and still carried himself like someone who expected to be the most important person in any room. The head of human resources, a black woman in her 50s who had spent her career navigating the particular challenges of her position, and showed the exhaustion of that navigation around her eyes. Legal counsel, regional directors, vice presidents of departments whose names contained too many words to remember easily. They had been talking quietly among themselves, the low murmur of executives waiting for something they weren't entirely sure how to handle. The murmur stopped when Henry's wheelchair appeared in the doorway. He rolled to the head of the table without waiting for an invitation. No announcement was necessary. No introduction required. He simply took his position, and the room adjusted around him like planets finding their orbits around a new sun. The silence stretched for a moment, then Henry spoke. Detroit Gate C-14, yesterday morning. He let the words hang in the air. Around the table, executives exchanged glances, some confused, some worried, some already calculating the implications for their own positions. Henry continued, his voice calm and measured, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades learning that shouting was almost always unnecessary. Kyle Bennett, gate agent, placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. Amanda Shaw, gate agent. Performance review initiated with documented pattern of behavior to be included in the file. Tracy Mills, gate supervisor, reassigned to a direct supervision training role pending further evaluation and possible rehabilitation. The head of HR was taking notes, her pen moving across paper with the practiced speed of someone who had transcribed many such directives. Legal counsel was already typing on a laptop, probably drafting the necessary documentation. The COO's face had gone slightly pale. "Mr. Lewis," the COO began, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone walking across a frozen lake. "If I may ask, what exactly occurred at Gate C-14 that warranted this level of response?" Henry turned to look at him. The gaze was not hostile, but it was not warm either. It was the look of a man who had been loading bags in the freezing cold while people like this COO were still learning to walk. What occurred, Henry said slowly, was that two employees of this airline decided that a passenger in a wheelchair was an appropriate target for mockery. They assumed that because I appeared elderly, because I appeared disabled, because I am black, that I did not warrant basic human dignity. They were wrong. The room was very quiet. They made jokes about wheelchair users seeking upgrades. They made comments about these people always wanting special treatment. They threatened to call security on a passenger whose only offense was following the instructions he had been given. And they did all of this within earshot of other employees and passengers, apparently believing that no one who mattered would ever hear about it. Henry's voice remained steady. No anger, no performance, just facts laid out in the order they had occurred. I want to be clear about something. This is not about revenge. I am not interested in destroying the careers of two people who made poor decisions on a Tuesday morning. I am interested in understanding how a corporate culture develops that makes such behavior feel acceptable. I am interested in the systems that allowed this to happen. I am interested in making sure that the next passenger who comes through gate C14, or any other gate in this airline's network, is treated with the dignity they deserve regardless of their age, their mobility, or the color of their skin. The HR director spoke for the first time. Mr. Lewis, may I ask about Tracy Mills? You mentioned reassignment rather than disciplinary action. Henry nodded slowly. Ms. Mills witnessed everything. She did not participate, but she also did not intervene. I understand the pressures that lead to silence in such situations. I understand fear for one's job, fear of retaliation, fear of making waves in an organization that does not reward wave makers. He paused. But silence in the face of injustice is a choice. Ms. Mills will have the opportunity to learn how to make a different choice. Whether she takes that opportunity is up to her. At that same moment, 700 miles north in Detroit, Kyle Bennett's phone was ringing. He was still at gate C14, having moved on to the next flight, having already forgotten the old man in the wheelchair, except as a story to tell during lunch break. He answered the phone with the casual confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. That confidence lasted approximately 15 seconds. The color drained from his face. His hand tightened on the phone. Other employees noticed. Amanda Shaw noticed. Tracy Mills, standing nearby, noticed most of all. When Kyle hung up, his hand was shaking. He looked around the gate like a man searching for an exit that didn't exist. Then he walked very quickly toward the employee area, not looking at anyone, not saying goodbye, not offering any explanation. Amanda's phone rang 30 seconds later. Her reaction was similar, though she tried harder to hide it. The mask cracked anyway. Tracy Mills watched both of them go. She had received her own call an hour earlier while the flight was still in the air. Reassignment. Direct supervision training role. The words had hit her like physical blows, but they had also carried something unexpected. A second chance. An opportunity to become the person she had always wanted to be, the person who spoke up instead of staying silent. She didn't know yet whether she would take that opportunity. But she knew, watching Kyle and Amanda disappear toward HR, that she had been given something they had not: grace. Back in Atlanta, Henry Lewis was finishing his directives. The executives around the table were nodding, taking notes, making the appropriate sounds of agreement and commitment to change. Some of them meant it. Some of them were just waiting for the meeting to end so they could calculate how this would affect their year-end bonuses. Henry could tell the difference. He had always been able to tell the difference. This isn't about two employees, he said, as the meeting drew toward its close. This is about every gate, every flight, every interaction between our staff and the passengers who pay our salaries. We will do better, and we will start today. 3 weeks after the incident at Gate C14, the ballroom of the Grand Hyatt in Dallas was filled with the most powerful people in American aviation. The National Aviation Leadership Summit drew executives from every major carrier, along with regulators, analysts, journalists, and the various hangers-on who always appeared when important people gathered in expensive venues. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that had probably been designed to make everyone feel appropriately impressed. The press conference had been announced with unusual secrecy. Meridian Air was expected to make a major leadership announcement, but the details had been kept remarkably quiet, especially in an industry where leaks were a constant problem. Speculation had run rampant in the weeks leading up to this moment. A merger, an acquisition, a major route expansion. No one had guessed the truth. The stage was set simply. A podium with the Meridian Air logo, a row of chairs behind it for the executives who would be introduced but not speaking, a screen for any visual presentations that might be necessary. The room hummed with the particular energy of people who knew they were about to witness something significant but didn't know exactly what. The moderator approached the podium. She was a veteran industry journalist who had covered aviation for 3 decades and had developed the polished manner of someone who had introduced hundreds of executives without letting any of them bore her audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "please welcome the new Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Air, Mr. Henry Lewis." For a moment, nothing happened. The name meant something to the older members of the audience, those who remembered the logistics revolution of the 80s and 90s, who had heard stories of the quiet genius who had transformed airline operations before disappearing into the background of corporate power. But most of the audience simply waited, expecting a traditional executive entrance. What they got was a wheelchair. Henry Lewis rolled toward the podium through a side entrance, moving at his own deliberate pace, making no effort to hurry for anyone's convenience. The room went utterly silent. Cameras began flashing with the frantic intensity that only occurred when journalists realized they had underestimated a story. He positioned himself behind the podium, the microphone adjusted to reach him in his seated position. His eyes moved across the crowd with the same quiet observation he had practiced in airports and boardrooms for decades. Then he spoke. "Yes, I use a wheelchair." The words hung in the air, simple and direct, refusing to apologize for stating the obvious. "Yes, I fly coach. Yes, I travel without announcing who I am. And yes, 3 weeks ago, I was mocked by employees of this airline for having the audacity to be old, black, and disabled in their presence." The murmur that ran through the crowd was audible. Journalists were typing furiously on phones and laptops. Executives from other airlines were exchanging meaningful glances. The story had just become much bigger than a routine leadership announcement. Henry continued, "I am not here to talk about myself. The days of my ego requiring public validation ended somewhere around my 50th birthday. I am here to talk about the moments that happen when no one thinks anyone important is watching. The casual cruelties, the whispered jokes, the assumptions made about people based on how they look rather than who they are." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "In Detroit 3 weeks ago, I experienced what thousands of passengers experience every day across this industry. I was dismissed. I was condescended to. I was threatened with security for the crime of following instructions I had been given. And I was mocked behind my back by employees who assumed that an old black man in a wheelchair couldn't possibly matter to their careers." His voice remained steady. No anger, no bitterness, just the calm presentation of facts. "They were wrong, but here is the thing that keeps me awake at night. What about all the passengers who aren't the CEO? What about the elderly grandmother traveling to see her grandchildren? What about the disabled veteran who served this country and now cannot walk? What about every person who has ever been made to feel less than human by someone with a name tag and a small amount of authority?" The room was absolutely still. I did not take this position for revenge. I took it because I have the power to change things, and power without action is just vanity. Starting today, Meridian Air will implement comprehensive training focused on passenger dignity. Starting today, our evaluation systems will include undercover assessments of how employees treat the most vulnerable travelers. Starting today, we will measure our success not just in on-time departures and revenue per seat, but in the basic human decency of every interaction. The applause began slowly, then built to something genuine. Henry waited for it to subside before continuing. In the weeks that followed, the consequences for those involved became public record. Termination was processed with the documentation that would follow him to any future job application in the industry. His confident smirk appeared in news coverage as the face of casual cruelty, the example of everything that was wrong with customer service in American aviation. His LinkedIn profile disappeared. His name became something that hearing managers searched for before interviews, finding articles that made clear why Meridian Air had let him go. Shaw resigned before her termination could be processed, hoping to control the narrative. It didn't help. The phrase complicit laughter appeared in multiple news stories, and her next job interview never materialized into an offer. Some consequences are quick and public, others are slow and private. Hers were both. Tracy Mills took a different path. 3 months after the incident, she stood in front of a training room at Meridian Air's Atlanta headquarters, facing a group of new employees who would be working at gates across the country. Her title was now Senior Trainer for Passenger Dignity Initiative, a position that had not existed before Henry Lewis created it. "I want to tell you a story," she said to the trainees. "About a day when I saw something wrong happening and said nothing. About the guilt that sat in my stomach like a stone. About the second chance I was given and what I've tried to do with it." She told them about Gate C-14, about jokes and laughter and her own silence, about the man in the wheelchair who saw everything and said nothing until the moment when saying something would actually matter. "I stayed quiet because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid for my job, afraid of retaliation, afraid of being labeled a troublemaker. Those fears were real, but silence protects the powerful. Speaking up protects everyone else. I needed someone to teach me that lesson, and I learned it the hard way." The trainees listened, with the particular attention of people who knew they were hearing something important. "You will face moments like the one I faced. Moments when someone with more authority than you is doing something wrong, and the easy path is to pretend you don't see it. I'm here to tell you that the easy path has a cost. It costs you pieces of yourself that you don't get back. It costs you the person you wanted to be when you took this job." After the training session, Tracy received a message asking her to come to the executive floor. Henry Lewis wanted to speak with her. She found him in his office, looking out over the Atlanta skyline, the city where so much black success had been built against so many obstacles. He turned his wheelchair when she entered, and his expression carried something that looked almost like peace. "You're doing good work," he said simply. "The feedback from your training sessions has been exceptional." Tracy shook her head. "I don't deserve the opportunity. I should have spoken up that day. I should have been braver." Henry regarded her for a long moment. "You stayed silent that day. I understand why. Fear is real, and it's not my place to pretend otherwise, but you spoke up when it mattered. You contacted before the plane even landed in Atlanta. You documented what you witnessed. You chose courage when you finally understood what was at stake." He paused. "That's what I'll remember." 6 months after the press conference in Dallas, Henry Lewis boarded a plane in Chicago. Coach class, window seat, leather briefcase on his lap. The routine was the same as it had always been, the deliberate choice to travel as an ordinary passenger rather than announcing his importance. The gate agent who checked his boarding pass was young, nervous, clearly new to the job. She looked at the wheelchair, then at the man in it, and something in her expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the training she had received in her first week. "Mr. Lewis," she said quietly, "welcome aboard. Is there anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable?" Henry smiled, the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in public in a very long time. "Just treat everyone the way you just treated me. That's all I've ever wanted." The agent nodded seriously. "Yes, sir, I will." He rolled down the jet bridge, finding his familiar seat by the window, settling in for another flight to another city where he would observe another set of employees who might or might not know they were being watched. The plane lifted off into a clear sky, and Henry looked down at the patchwork of America spreading out below him. He could have stopped traveling like this. He could have accepted the first-class upgrades that were now automatically offered. He could have sent assistants ahead to smooth his path and announce his arrival, but that would have defeated the purpose. The day you stop watching is the day the world feels safe again. The day you assume that systems have been fixed is the day those systems start to break. Henry Lewis had learned that lesson over 63 years of being a black man in America, and he had no intention of forgetting it now. This story was never about a man in a wheelchair. It was about a world that still judges people before they speak. It was about the quiet truth that power doesn't always look like power. It was about the dignity that belongs to every person who has ever been made to feel invisible. Henry Lewis didn't ask for revenge. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply remembered. And when the time came, he acted with the patient precision of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for exactly that moment. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. So here is my question for you. Was the punishment enough for what and did? Or should there have been more? Tell me in the comments what you think justice looks like, because this conversation matters. And if you have ever been treated like you were invisible, if you have ever been dismissed because of how you looked or the chair you sat in or the color of your skin, then tell me your story. This channel exists for voices like yours. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and remember that the next story might hit even closer to home.